Well, good morning. So we're going to have to be a little flexible here. If you haven't heard, there's some weather events going on in the country, and we're missing one of our panelists, but we think he's going to show up, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes or so. So you might see somebody walk up in a bit. So good morning, everyone. I hope you had a great day yesterday. We're really looking forward to an action-packed day today. We have the distinct honor of following the enlightening panel from yesterday about the struggles of menopausal women.
Struggle's real.
Yeah, it is real, as you know personally, right?
I'm an OB-GYN.
Yeah.
Say that.
I have some insight too.
So, but we're here to cover a more exciting topic. Wait for it: provider data management. So tough act to follow, but you know, we all know that provider data management is it's riddled with issues, right? There's inaccuracies. People are working from spreadsheets. There's friction. There's challenges with data sharing, that sort of thing. So what we want to do today is to talk about ways to solve the problem, right? It's not just administrative efficiencies, but there's real-world impacts, patient care, right? Operational efficiencies for the health plans. So while the data can be unreliable, patients suffer, providers struggle, and we're left wondering, are we going to see the light at the end of the tunnel? So today, we're not just here to talk about the problem. We're actually here to tackle the pressing question of how do we unite to fix the problem? So throughout the panel, we're going to explore what are some innovative solutions, maybe share some success stories, hopefully leave the panel with a few actionable strategies to help us turn this chaos into a reality. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So my name is Christina Rawlings, and as Pete said, I'm the Chief Growth Officer with CAQH. And for those who don't know, our mission is to provide the most comprehensive, accurate provider and member data to the industry at large. So we're excited about this topic. I think we've got a fantastic panel. We're represented by stakeholders across the industry. So again, our goal today is how can we unite to fix this problem? We can't fix it just as payers. We can't fix it just as providers. We can't fix it as vendors, right? We all have to work together to solve the problem. So with that, I want to introduce our fantastic panel. So next to me, I have Jamila Sykes. She's the Vice President of Provider Data and Reimbursement Operations with Highmark Health. So she's going to provide her experience to shed some light on the operational challenges faced in managing vast amounts of provider data and the impact on both healthcare delivery and administrative efficiency. Dr. Ashish Shah, or Ash, as he likes to be called, is the Chief Growth Officer at Monogram Health, where he leads the charge on transforming kidney care through innovative value-based models. With over 2 decades of experience as a physician, as he just said, healthcare attorney, and an executive, Dr. Shah brings a unique multidisciplinary perspective of modernizing chronic disease management. His leadership in healthcare strategy and product innovation has made, made him a recognized thought leader and dedicated in creating equitable, patient-centered solutions that benefit providers, payers, and patients alike. I'd also like to introduce Lori Prestisator to the right of Ash. Lori is the SVP of Health Solutions for the American Medical Association. This organization serves as a physician's powerful ally in patient care, leading the charge to prevent chronic disease and confront public health crises, and driving the future of medicine to tackle the biggest challenges in healthcare and training the leaders of tomorrow. Lori's going to offer her perspective on the role that the association plays in shaping data management practices and fostering collaboration among stakeholders. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Amit now, but you may see him walk in about 15 minutes or so, but we'll probably be in the middle of conversation, so I thought it'd be good to give you some background. So Amit Garg is the Chief Chief Executive Officer for High Labs, which is a cutting-edge technology firm dedicated to cleansing and refining healthcare data. His insights are going to provide us a glimpse into the technological advancements that could revolutionize data quality and integration. So with that, why don't we dive in? So Jamila, I'd like to start with you. Can you share with us the most pressing challenges to link payers and providers for particularly regarding provider data management as it's related to demographic data, credentialing data, contractual reimbursement data?
Absolutely, and I'm excited that we're going to be talking about solutions, but I'm also excited to be able to admire the problem with probably a lot of people who live and breathe very similar problems. I'd say a couple of things are really important about the provider data space. Number one, it's a moving target. It's a many-to-many relationship. It's inconsistent, so just because you got great data yesterday doesn't mean you're going to get great data tomorrow. Defining good data and high quality data has so many different elements. When did you get it? How recent is it? What's the fidelity? And because it's such a complex space, and as I mentioned, it's a many-to-many relationship, you can't make assumptions. Well, if this, then that. No, you really have to get it right. And I'd say that's the second challenge, that the fidelity required for provider data, to your point, it has real impacts, operational, it has impacts to the providers, it also has impacts to the payers, so it's really important to get it right. So I bet we've all been in a conversation about how Gen AI is going to save us from everything. Like, Gen AI is pretty good at suggesting good information, but the level of fidelity required of provider data means you have to get it right. You can't just kind of get it right, be in the right ballpark, but you actually have to 100% get it right. And for operational teams like my own, not only is that a point of pride, but also that is a point of necessity. And getting it right means a really deep engagement between payers and providers. And let's be honest, everybody's pretty busy. Our provider partners, they have to take care of patients. They've got life or death decisions that they're trying to make. So making sure that their address is correct for their payer partners, it matters, but there's so many other priorities. So really finding ways to manage provider data in a way that's operationally efficient for both the payers as well as the providers, it's a real challenge. That providers are dealing with many different payers who are asking for different things, and we have to really be conscientious of that. And then as payers, we have to make sure that what we're asking for is meaningful data, and we're asking for it in ways that make sense administratively and operationally so that we get what we need without being a burden to our provider partners. So as I said, there's many ways to admire the problem, but those really stand out as the recurrent themes when you think about managing and keeping up with and getting consistent provider data.
Thank you, that was very insightful, and we commonly hear that, particularly from the payers that we work with regularly, and I think that leads to, welcome Amit, we've already done your introduction, so welcome to the panel. But I think that leads to the next question that I have, which is for you, Ash, and that is, how does the proprietary nature of provider data and the shift to value-based care impact how we approach data management? So as Jamila talks about getting that data from providers, but not burdening them too much, how do we get over that hump and really get the data that we need, and that there's transparency with the type of data that we need? Because you talked about having the right type of data, which can be a challenge, I think, getting that from the providers.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a complex question, and maybe I'll give a little bit of background from my view to help understand my answer to your question. So at Monogram Health, we're the leading multi-specialty provider, risk provider of kidney care. We focus on the drivers of care, and so we're both care delivery and care management, and we stand in between what would be a network provider, a payer, and 80% of the time we're the provider, 20% of the time we're a provider working on the extension of existing providers, and 20% of the time we take on the care. Ours are typically 3-year agreements where we're asked to bend the MLR year one, and so we're constantly seeking out data to say what is good, who's adhering to good, and our partners, our payer partners, are increasingly coming to us by year 2 or 3 and saying, hey, if there's 100 providers and only 50 of them are doing the right thing, how do we steer? And I share this with you to let you know that the first thing in addressing your question is there needs to be a drive on the part of the provider to say, we're not going to fight anymore the need to collect data or define what is good, but lead that discussion and say, we're going to define what is good, and more importantly, going to give what is context. Because we all know that said no physician or provider ever, when they wake up in the morning, I want to be mediocre. And yet the data may reflect that they're not where they may want to be or where they should be or where they could be. And my experience in the payer world has always been that when presented with data and given an opportunity to discuss it, people react positively. They look at their data, they adapt their ability to provide care or the cost of care or referrals. And so the first thing in solving for this problem is to eliminate this entrenchment of, I don't want to make a value judgment. And I'm here to say the value judgment's already happening. The data's being collected as imperfect as it is. And people like us in a risk model are forced to rely on that data and make decisions, and more importantly, make decisions that say we're going to steer away or to. The second part is to understand that value-based care is accelerating this kind of need to collect data, and we're doing it, and it's very imperfect. The payers are limited on what they have, we're limited on what we have, and so we're forced, meaning the community that takes on risk, to fill in the gaps. And again, we're trying to involve providers and payers in it, but at the end of the day, we don't have a lot of time to debate the merits of something or to say, well, that element doesn't exist. And every day there are pieces in our data collection that are simple fixes, but our systems aren't designed to do it. And I'll give you one simple example. I had this conversation with a payer a couple days ago. They said, what can we do to improve your engagement rate? We were talking about getting to the hardest access patients. And any given approach, it doesn't matter where you've been, whether you're a payer, whether you're a provider, whether you're a vendor of services, I think it's safe to say most will struggle between 20 and 30%, the unable to reach. And we rely on third-party data to get a phone number, to get a cell phone, to get an address. And I said to them, look, you have a massive PBM. I've never known a PBM that when you refill a script doesn't ask for a cell phone or sends you a message. Are you overriding, or do you have a field when that person refills that says, here's the most recent contact information? And their answer was, no, we don't. And their question was, how do we engage more because we want to drive more to our PBM? So, well, the first thing is just let's think about this from a longitudinal point of view. You have data that you're not connecting. It's not a you have it or not. You're just not connecting it to the flow or the approach. And I think if you put a provider in the driver's seat, somebody who says, well, look, I prescribed that med. You want me to make sure they have that med. I can't connect with them about that med, but you have a cell phone. Help me help you. That's the first step. But I think ultimately what I would say is providers need to lead and drive and add context, that context of that flow, so that we don't design more imperfect systems that don't get either one of us or all of us what we need.
I love your comment about context, right? And it ties back to something Jamila was saying, which is AI is great, and it can suggest things, right? But if you're not getting the right data in, then what good is it going to be, right? And I think about just my personal use times of using ChatGPT. I had just a little example. We had to create a video that we were creating this video for my uncle's 60th birthday, and I wanted to do a video of a poem, and I'm not very good at writing poems, and so I went into ChatGPT, but it probably took me about 18 prompts, and the more context that I gave it about my uncle, the better the poem got, and eventually I got to exactly what I wanted. And so when you talk about context and you talk about AI and how it can help, when you combine those things, it can be pretty powerful. And how are we giving the stakeholders what they need to be able to use the information effectively and efficiently? So, Lori, I'd like to ask you, what role do you see for national organizations like the AMA, who is a powerful ally of the physician, to help solve some of those problems around provider data management, really across different healthcare systems?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that this is all of our problems, right? It's a problem that impacts all of us. And so the thing that, the AMA and other large organizations do well is to convene and help with collaboration, which is necessary to solve this problem. And so while we would always suggest the physician should be at the front of innovation and driving innovation so that it works for the physician, it's not just a physician problem, right? It's a problem across the industry. And maybe a way for us to start in that area is around standards. And so we're talking about the context and a lot of different, how to receive the data, but agreeing on a set of standards that will allow us to communicate and to share data and to efficiently collect it would be a big step for the industry. And it's hard work. So we have been a small piece of this. We've been working for over 2 years now with ACGME and AAMC to agree on a set of standards for really demographic data. A small subset of data. It's a handful of data elements. But coming to agreement around that standard takes a lot of effort, is harder than you think, but really will be very impactful. We're close to releasing the standard, and it's a standard, so nobody owns the standard, right? It's a standard, so we really have to do it in a collaborative way that helps move us forward. And I think it's a small example of where we can start with this very large problem to help us move forward. I also think that at a national level, we really need to look at how it affects the patient. And that's maybe the leg of the stool we haven't talked about up here. But it does have a significant impact on a patient, right? It has an impact around access to care. It has an impact around, the availability and network management. And it's an important piece to understand that we have to, whatever we do, really needs to protect the patient, and I would actually say perhaps puts the patient at the center of this conversation, as opposed to any of the organizations who are currently managing the data. And then, finally, I guess I would say, it really needs to ensure that this doesn't place additional burden on physicians. So, many of the solutions we see are individual places that a physician needs to go to update data. And the AMA has done a tremendous amount of research in this area. And the things that will drive physicians to adopt technology are, does it work? And does it work in my workflow? Or does it add additional burden to what I'm already doing? And so finding ways that we can get this updated data in a manner that is efficient, consistent, and low burden to drive benefit for patients is really the role we see ourselves advocating for and playing.
That's a great perspective, and certainly a big focus that we have, right? Amit, can you speak to advanced technologies, as a high-tech firm focused on this, to reduce inconsistencies in provider data, improve data accuracy, because we know that needs some work, right? And what role does partnerships, payers and providers and technology companies play in making these solutions scalable?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to speak with this esteemed panel. My apologies for being late. The traffic was horrible, so sorry. I feel like I'm representing the AI community to solve this problem. So as you mentioned, Kristen, it's not just the data accuracy issues, but also we have done a study with the University of Colorado around the data inconsistencies. So we did this study, and that study was published at the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, where in this study we found that 85% of the times the physician practice addresses were inconsistent across the top national payers directories. 85% of the times. Right? And that same study was also recently referenced in the MedPAC report to the Congress. So there's a problem to solve, right? And we have seen that technology, and especially in today's world where technology, especially the generative artificial intelligence, can actually reason like humans, right? It can truly replicate a subject matter expert researching about a provider, right? And what we have seen the technology, and that has to be married with the principles of responsible AI and calibrated execution in partnership with payers and providers. The combination of all of these, with that we have seen significant opportunities to improve the data quality and data consistency. We had the opportunity to work with many payers, including the national level players all the way up to regional MA plans. And then if we go upstream, which is how the data is being exchanged, as you were talking about, right? How there are no standards, right? So many of us are aware of this whole provider rosters data exchange process, right? Where there's no standard, and it's not fair to expect providers to create like 100 versions of the same data and send to the payers. So there also we have seen utilizing the right combination of technology and the right or calibrated rollout operation strategy. We have seen that we have been able to reduce like thousands of manual operators' work using technology. So I think we have a massive opportunity here with the right mix of technology and the operational process to solve this problem.
Yeah. I love the perspective that each of you shared, right? Because when we talk about what are some actionable strategies and how do we unite to fix it, and we talk about, the challenges that you face without, trying to increase the burden on providers. You've talked about the transparency of information. How do we add context to it? Lori talked about standards, and you talked about technologies. And so I'd like to understand, and anybody can respond to this, but how can different stakeholders across what we've just talked about come together to improve data quality and sharing? How do we combine those things to really create some momentum here to increase data accuracy?
Christina, I think one thing, it's dawning on me as we're talking, we're all talking about data from a different perspective. And at the end of the day, I think all this data collection, this data work, to what end? It should be, as you said, to benefit the patient, ultimately. Like, what are your office hours? What's your address? What patients you serve? What is your patient makeup, your complexity? All of that is to match, I believe. What are your outcomes, generally speaking, just as, how do people stack against a standard or in a community standard? What is your cost? Are you an outlier? I think it starts with agreeing to some general principles. If not, we all are going to go in different directions. There will be administrative uses, there'll be clinical uses, there'll be financial uses, but absent that North Star, they just become things that get collected. And that example I gave you of all that data that gets collected from a payer and a PBM and to us never gets connected. And the purpose of all this data is to serve a greater good. And for everybody to recognize that a question about, as an example, do you offer after hours, is meant with an intent. How do I match that opportunity and that resource to a need? So to collect it and then have it lay out there and not have any actionability to it is just as egregious as not wanting to collect it. And also, are we using this data to an intended purpose? Am I going back and saying, hey, network, 70% of people offer, I'm using the same example, after hours. You 30% aren't. Have you thought about doing that to keep up with the Joneses? All of this has to have a purpose. That purpose needs to be really centered around the patient generally. And there's lots of ways to get to the patient. It's not a myopic view. But it seems to me we all have our business imperatives. We're all doing what we need to do. And the first step is to not just get in a room. And the work is ongoing and it's hard. And you're just focused, just on the first step of demographics. Imagine clinical value and quality on the other stuff. But we got to get in and have some guiding principles that say, these are the overarching reasons why these things are being done. And then there's the also balance of Who's got the burden of all of that?
Well, and that's where I was going to push on that a little bit, right? I agree with you. I think it's what is the purpose, right? And are we fully maximizing the purpose of all the data that we're collecting? Where do you, whose responsibility do you see in all these stakeholders we've been talking about in defining those purposes and make sure it's being maximized, if you will?
Is that to me?
It's to you, to Lori, whoever wants to respond.
Well, I would say the first thing we should, until incentives are aligned, we're going to have a very difficult time solving this problem. And aligning incentives is not easy because, as you reference, everyone has a different perspective. But I think we have to figure out how to align incentives. And the impact to everybody is slightly different, as you know, as you've heard from all of us up on the stage. But you know, and this study's a little dated, but you know, 52% of patients said that they still had some kind of negative impact from an inaccurate directory. So it's not covered. The physician was, you know, there's some impact to them, and that's a very high percentage of people, just based on inaccurate directory information. So, you know, you can, if we start looking at the impacts to each organization, and how do we get those aligned, perhaps we can start doing some of the work. And I think I don't think it's a sea shift or a sea change, I guess that's the right word. I think it's incremental steps to make this better. That probably starts with each of the physician has a responsibility to report the data. The health plan or the payer has a responsibility to update the data. The patient has the responsibility to access and look at the data. There's places for industry to innovate and provide solutions that allow us to do it with more efficiency and accuracy.
I would also jump in and say that there's a degree of humility that's required, that none of us independently have all the answers, all the solutions, and to say, instead of looking at the mirror, you know, the change starts with the person in the mirror. I think in this case you have to look outside the window and look at your partners and look at the people who you might consider on the other side of the aisle and say, well, what is your experience? And not assume that any one of us has all the answers. And secondarily to that, it's really important to have partners, whether it's AMA or CAQH, who bring together all of the different parties, kind of demand that, you know, mutual interest and accountability, and bring together those spaces for collaboration where everybody kind of says, well, I'm not the end all be all of the solution. And agreeing on those standards and solutions requires a degree of humility that's like, okay, I have to give up something in order to get something. All of those standards require a degree of compromise and seeing things from another payer or a provider or a tech solution that may not be what you came to the table with originally. But that's why it's so important to have those spaces. I would consider them the neutral zones, those who have a vested interest but are willing to bring together all of the different partners to have some really tough conversations. We've come together even with some of our state regulators, like credentialing data is a mess. Every payer is asking for a different thing. How do we bring together standards? And that's just one slice of data of credentialing. But then you can kind of end up in the bickering of, well, I need this one data point, and I need this one data point, and nobody's justifying what's it for and how's it going to serve the end purpose. It's just that this is what my system needs, and you kind of end up in these lock jams. But it's important to keep pushing through that and keep creating those spaces to have those conversations, and we have to continue to show up assuming we already have a problem, we already know that. Let's come up with some new solutions. Let's be creative. Let's be open to somebody else's solution, technology, platform, approach that I wasn't doing before. And I think that requires even a cultural change within the industry of who's right and who's wrong, and kind of letting go of that, of like who has the right data or the right approach.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And go back to what Lori said about incentives, right? When you think about how long we've been trying to get value-based care to work, right? And I don't think it really started to become scalable until the incentives were aligned. When they were first developed, it was all about financial outcomes. There was no consideration for clinical outcomes. And until it started to evolve and clinical outcomes became part of it, and it became a blend, and then it was not just the payer, but how do we bring on the providers and all agree and align the incentives, it really wasn't something that was scalable. I think it was in pilot mode for about 10 years before it really took off. But this is no different, right? Because it's going to take that collaboration across the industry, and to get that collaboration, the incentives have to be aligned.
Yeah.
It's the only thing that drives that kind of change.
Yeah, and I think I would say, as Jamila said, that this problem needs strong collaboration, and the lines needs to be blurred in terms of like who is supposed to do what, right? So it should not be the burden for the providers. It's always for the providers to submit the data, right? To submit the updates. Payers many times have access to broader set of data sets than the providers, right? Now payers are also acquiring a lot of EMR data beyond the claims and administrative data. And there should be scenarios where payers are saying, hey, Dr. John Doe, do you still feel that one of your group members, group provider is working at this location? Looks like from the data set that you found, looks like the location is different now, right? And then it becomes easier for the provider to provide that information, right? Instead of sending the traditional rosters and traditional data sets, right? So I think that's very much required, that if we can collaborate to solve this problem, because as you said, 52% of times, if people have incorrect data, that's something that we need to really solve for.
Good, thank you. I think I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience.
Questions? Hold your hand up, stand up, don't be shy. We're here to make friends.
I think we've got one over here, Sam.
Really great discussion, and I think this problem is one of the hardest, one of the dumbest problems in all of healthcare, right? We spend so much time on this, we burden providers with it. And I just wanted to call out that I think that there's a model that we've seen that is worthy of exploration, and it's actually the CAQH universal application, right? CAQH made a bold move, put this application out there. By the way, I'm an attendee, I'm not from CAQH.
He's a plant.
But put out this application with just a critical mass of payers behind it. It didn't require everybody. And now it is functionally the standard. I think that the point that we have to make the incentives align kind of starts with saying, well, who can go out there and just put out a solution that makes it easier for the providers, makes it easier for the organizations credentialing them? That's the incentive, right? I think we all know that the time is going in, and we need standards. We need to agree on what demographic information should look like. But I don't know. I think CAQH has kind of like led the charge in terms of demonstrating what could be possible if we do it on the data side as well.
Thank you for that, and I did not pay him.
I would have, go for it.
I agree, appreciate the comment. I also want to emphasize something, clarify a couple of comments just to make sure. I don't think this, to be very clear, this is not a burden of any one party. It should not be. It's not a burden of providers. I want to see providers lead the charge where they can because of the contextual issue. I do also want to emphasize that we've all said it. There is a value to this data. It should not be gratuitous. There's always going to be a burden of some kind of administrative aspect, and whether it's a payer burden, a technology burden, a provider burden, but it should be valued. And if done correctly, the data collection, the type of data, will far exceed any ability to align incentives. But healthcare is fraught with a bunch of unfunded mandates on everybody's part, with the hope of creating value. This is one of those areas where it creates value. We just need to recognize it, and then if it is a fee that needs to be paid, pay it. If it's a cost that needs to be borne that creates administrative efficiencies, let's do it. But it also starts, again, with that first willingness, get everybody in a room, somebody be a parent, and we gotta, acknowledge that we're not gonna get 100%, we're gonna get 80, 75%, we're gonna give up 20, 25%, but to what end has to be this unifying principle that it'll make life better, it'll make it administratively easier, It will improve the patient, enhance quality, and I don't think this is Pollyanna. And as I said on the onset, those of us in the risk world are going to do it, and we're going to do it imperfectly. And so we might as well all join on this and push this agenda. It can be done. The caveat I would say with examples of pilots, not to say that what you said was example of this, is I would resist the urge in this space to start with these small activities because they just become insular. Oh, that's the California way of doing it. That's the New York way of doing it. And then it goes back to, well, my system can't really do that. And what you got is a cornucopia of other solutions that then therefore don't become solutions.
Thank you for saying that.
I do think, though, there's a way to start small that is not perhaps regionally, right? I do think there's a way that we might start working on location, provider location. We might pick something, right, that is universal, but that would allow us to get into this space in a way that, we start collaborating across industry. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. I think the other thing is that the silos, and I think we've talked about this, a lot of people have siloed data, I don't know, and that is inaccurate, right? And so we each need to get the accuracy of our data before we start trying to share it, because it's important, and we all, to your point on being humble, we all need to acknowledge how hard that is. So, I think at least we talk about it at the AMA, physician data ages at 2 to 3% a month. That's 30% a year. That's a lot of data to keep updated, and that all of us have right now are keeping updated. If we could figure out a way to share that data in a standardized format, I think it might help us. I know the AMA makes over 500,000 inbound and outbound calls verifying data a year, which is not, it's kind of hard to argue that that's efficient, right?
Yeah. And to your point, it's not just one region or product or solution. For us, from a payer perspective, we're taking layers of solutions. So the CAQH application, we would die without it from a credentialing process perspective. But when we look, 51% of the data that we get on that application, we still have to go get more information. It's wrong, it's incomplete. So it is the best starting point, and we still have to continue to layer on solutions and products to get to that accuracy point. So how do we
help the provider to make it more complete?
Exactly. So we want as much good information as we can the first time around, but being realistic, we're not going to get it. So we have to think about data solutioning, not just from like one good product or one good pilot, but how do you layer on solutions? And that's where it becomes difficult and complex and all of that good stuff. But I think that also shares the burden of, hey, if we're going to come to a solution, it's not going to be one silver bullet, but you got to start with something.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I completely agree, Jamila. And as you said, let's start with something small, right? So with one of the health plans, what we did, we took a phased approach where we had several guardrails before we go and clean these millions of records, right? So for example, let's focus on some of the providers' data which impact the most vulnerable population, right? Or let's focus on locations related to the primary care physicians, right? And then there's also a trust building phase with technology, right? And in that phase approach, we have seen that we went live with several markets of health plan. But that phase approach, taking smaller steps, that's the way to go, along with, as you said, multiple layers of strategy as well as solutions.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we've got one back here.
Okay.
Good morning, Michael Marchant. I'm at Sutter Health. One of the challenges is that the determination of what is required data, like who's the arbiter of what's required, right? Payer has their data set, provider has their data set, the state may have their data set. So part of the challenge here is that there's no foundational person, organization, legality, regulation that says, these are the foundations of what you have to have. I work in interop, so one of the challenges for directory management is fire endpoints and direct addresses, right? there's not one arbiter of those either. So I think that part of the challenge is to be able to solve this problem, and I'm interested in the panel's opinion, is that there needs to be something that agrees that this is the data that we're going to work with, and then who owns it. Because we talk about golden records all the time. Well, each organization has their own golden record that feeds their internal systems. And you're talking about a golden record that feeds external systems. And I think until we get to a point where we all can agree to the rules of what is that golden record in a federated way, it'll be difficult to achieve the goals that you've talked about. So I'm interested in knowing what direction, how do we get to a golden record that can be shared in a federated way that we all agree to? Because my legal and compliance for credentialing providers may be very different in California than it might be in Nevada. So those things also compound that effort. Sure. So just interested in your opinions there. Thank you.
So I can respond unless anybody wants to take that one. So this is something, so to your point about starting with something small, one of the core competencies that we have at CAQH is aligning stakeholders to agree on standards, right? Our core organization has developed standards for administrative efficiencies that 10 of them have become CMS mandates, right? So it is a core competency of ours. And to the comment earlier, that's really how ProView, which is now called Provider Data Portal, got started, right? It is how do we create a single place for providers to enter information that can be disseminated to the health plans that need it. And we started a project earlier this year called the Universal Group Roster because there were challenges around collecting rosters for delegated groups. And the problem is what we found was that as we looked across 13 health plans and the rosters that they were collecting, 85% of the data was the same, but asked in different ways. So it created that burden for that delegate who might be entering 1,000 providers, right, on the roster to enter that information 5 different ways. And so we got all the plans in the room to say, okay, let's go through it. Do you really need to ask it this way? And it was interesting to see, you talked about giving something up, right, to help solve a problem. And there were comments like, well, we did it this way, but this way might be better. Or do you really need this? What is this used for? Okay, maybe we don't. It's just something we've always done, but we don't use it anymore. And so it was interesting to see that evolve. And then as we start to expand that to other stakeholders, providers and associations and those sorts of things, it'll be interesting to see that alignment come together. Because it sounds like something small, but it's not. I mean, it can impact the entire industry as we think about how pervasive delegated groups are now in collecting that information. Anything else anybody else wants to share as far as an example?
I would just add one comment that sometimes when you're creating these standards, if everybody gets what they want, it becomes a very heavy wagon, and the wagon cannot move. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about creating the universal repository, then we have the tendency to over-ask and over-club it so that everybody gets what they need and they can pull from it. So those compromises are really important, but we have to really be thoughtful about the trade-offs as well, because those are some real trade-offs that may not be obvious on the surface. So I think that those standards are really important, but also the clearinghouses, whether that's CAQH or other tech partners that can manipulate and serve as that clearinghouse. Maybe they don't have the golden record, but they have at least the ability to manipulate what comes in and what comes out so that it is helpful to all parties without creating that really heavy wagon of overclubbing and everybody just got their hopes and wishes in there, and now you're just throwing data out there, mm-hmm. and hopefully somebody's pulling out of it what they need. So I think it's going to be an evolution, and hopefully it'll be quite organic as we play with it, try new things, see what some new approaches look like, that conversation about the delegated rosters and how do we evolve that. Maybe one conversation isn't going to fix it, but I think we need to continue to have that dialogue and keep that golden record as our goal without over-clubbing it too quickly just to say that we got it done.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it goes back to what Ash was saying about purpose, right? And are we putting the information in there for a specific purpose, right? How are we going to use it? What are the downstream use cases?
I think that's a place that many national organizations need to come together to figure out what is really needed. And so just as the example I used with ACGME and AAMC, we've all had to, I mean, it's been a negotiation, even on a small subset of data. But I think if we can all come together, we can probably, have the best chance at solving this problem. Because I think we want to solve it. I don't think we want the government to solve it. I think we want to be the ones to solve this problem. So we need to figure out how to come together and reach accommodation to move this forward.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
We got one more question back here. No pressure.
Okay.
Hi, Kevin Terrell, Birch AI. Perhaps start with Jamila, but I think you said 51% of the time you get a golden record, if you will, the first time. Just wondering what you think, as you look at all the different data sources you have and then where you eventually get, what do you think is a realistic golden record percentage in the next 2 to 3 years? Like, can we get to 90%, 95%, 99%? What do you think is possible?
That would be so
realistically
exciting.
possible.
But not realistic. That's a really quick question. So the 51% was around our credentialing application. So when we get the application, 51% of the time it's incomplete and inaccurate. We have to follow up and get 1, 2, 3 additional pieces of information that we didn't get with that initial application. So realistically, I would love to be somewhere around 80% because every time you do that credentialing application, it's every 3 years. There's a lot of detail in there, and sometimes something gets overlooked. We're human beings dealing with human beings. That's to be expected. But to get northward of 80% that first time around, not only does it save us time, but it saves that, whether it's the practice, the individual physician, whoever, it saves them time from the follow-ups that we have to do that takes away from patient time, that takes away from either other administrative time, just to say, where is your certificate of insurance? What's your real date of birth? Because I don't think you were born in 1902. So it's really meaningful, even though 80% isn't close to that 99, maybe in another 5 years. I'd love to get close to that 90+%. But over the next year or two, I'm really hoping we get northwards of 80%. And that's not just...
We'd do backflips, wouldn't we?
Right? I would be delighted.
Okay, well, I want to thank the group. I think I loved the insights that each of you provided, and we look forward to solving the problem together, right? Okay.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you.